January 17, 1943. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the clouded sky, its surface broken only by the dark silhouettes of planes as they soared in formation. The sun hung low, casting a cold glow over the chaos of the battlefield. In the distance, the roar of engines echoed across the waters as American and Japanese fighters engaged in a fierce dogfight. Amidst the chaos, one group of Japanese pilots, after a relentless battle, found themselves spiraling toward the earth. Their planes, damaged by gunfire, plummeted into the sea, creating plumes of water that splashed high into the air. In a moment of panic and desperation, the remaining pilots ejected and crash-landed on a distant island, an American stronghold. As the Japanese men were led away, their bodies weary and faces strained with the fear of capture, they were guided into a small American medical tent. There, the contrast between the harsh realities of war and the surreal kindness of their captors could not have been starker. The men, battered and broken, were offered water, medicine, and a rare, almost incomprehensible gesture of humanity. One pilot, overwhelmed by the gentleness of the soldiers, glanced at his comrades and whispered, "Is this heaven?" The year 1943 marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater of World War II. The war had been raging across the Pacific for nearly 2 years, with brutal battles fought in the skies, on the seas, and on the islands that dotted this vast ocean. By this time, Japan's Imperial Navy had achieved several early victories, but the tide was beginning to turn. The United States, with its unmatched industrial capabilities and determination, had started to gain the upper hand, especially after the surprise victory at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. In the summer of 1942, Japan's ambitions for an expanded empire were severely checked by the combined might of the Allied forces. As American and Japanese forces clashed over strategic locations, such as Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima, the skies above these islands became increasingly deadly. American fighters, including the iconic F-6F Hellcats, engaged Japanese aircraft in dogfights that pushed both sides to the brink of exhaustion. The Japanese, known for their skill in aerial combat, faced a growing challenge as their resources dwindled and the Allies advanced. The capture of enemy pilots became an invaluable tactic in this ongoing war of attrition. Japanese pilots, many of whom had received rigorous and brutal training, were a formidable threat. However, the Allies knew that taking one of these men alive could yield critical intelligence, valuable information on Japan's strategies, and potentially an advantage in future battles. By 1943, the U.S. forces were increasingly prepared for handling prisoners of war, especially after the brutal lessons learned from earlier engagements. The Geneva Conventions, signed by the United States and other major powers, provided a framework for the humane treatment of prisoners, although the realities of war often led to violations. Nonetheless, the American military's approach to caring for their captives was evolving, particularly in the case of captured airmen. Medical personnel, despite the harsh conditions of war, were committed to providing the best care possible, even for the enemy. For the Japanese pilots, this would be their first exposure to the Allied treatment of prisoners, which contrasted sharply with the brutal nature of the Imperial Army's own methods. The Pacific theater was a brutal stage for combat, where the survival of soldiers and airmen often depended on their ability to endure and adapt to the harsh conditions. For the Japanese pilots, the process of capture was something they had been trained to avoid at all costs. Japanese military doctrine held that surrender was dishonorable, and to be captured was considered the ultimate failure. This mindset was deeply ingrained in the Japanese military culture, where death in battle was seen as a more honorable outcome than becoming a prisoner of war. As a result, many Japanese pilots fought to the death, rather than risk falling into enemy hands. However, those who were captured were not often afforded the same level of care as their American counterparts. Japan's treatment of prisoners was harsh, with many POWs subjected to forced labor, inadequate food, and physical punishment. For the captured Japanese pilots, the stark contrast of American treatment was an eye-opening experience. While they had been taught to view the Americans as the enemy, they were now confronted with a form of humanity they had not anticipated, medical personnel providing care not just out of necessity, but with genuine concern for their well-being. The American approach to POWs, particularly airmen, was shaped by the lessons learned from earlier wars. Unlike the Japanese, the United States took great pains to adhere to the Geneva Conventions, which laid out the standards for the treatment of prisoners. Although there were exceptions, especially in cases of extreme strategic importance, most American forces followed the rules, offering medical care, adequate rations, and humane treatment. For American military medics, there was an unspoken understanding that, regardless of nationality, their duty was to treat every wounded soldier or airman, even the enemy, with the same professionalism and care. This ethos of care and compassion was exemplified in the field hospitals that operated in the Pacific. American doctors and medics, often working under dire conditions and with limited resources, would perform life-saving procedures on their own troops, but they also extended the same medical care to captured Japanese pilots. The reaction from the Japanese prisoners varied. Some, deeply distrustful of their captors, initially refused medical treatment, while others, exhausted and in pain, gratefully accepted the care offered. In one such hospital, a Japanese pilot, barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, was placed under the care of an American medic. The medic, a seasoned veteran of the war, had tended to countless injuries, both American and enemy, but something about this particular moment struck him. As the medic began to clean the pilot's wounds, he saw the man's eyes, filled with confusion and fear, but also something else, a glimmer of humanity. This small moment, where a wounded enemy soldier was treated with dignity, would resonate in ways neither man could fully understand at the time. For the captured Japanese pilots, the experience of American medical care was profoundly disorienting. Raised to view the enemy as less than human, they had never expected the kindness they were now receiving. Most of the pilots had spent their careers learning to fly at incredible speeds, engaged in merciless aerial combat, and enduring the constant pressure of war. They were trained not only to fight, but to die for their emperor. To be forced to surrender, to experience the physical vulnerability of being wounded and captured, was a deeply traumatic experience. It shattered the psychological armor they had built throughout their military careers. Yet, as the first aid was administered, something remarkable began to happen. The men, who had feared the worst, began to experience a subtle shift. Some, who had expected rough treatment or even execution, found themselves being offered water, medicine, and care. One pilot, whose leg had been shattered during the battle, looked up in disbelief as an American medic carefully bandaged his wound. He expected to see contempt in the medic's eyes, but instead he saw only professionalism and concern. In that moment, the harsh divisions between us and them began to blur. The pilot whispered, "Is this heaven?" Not in the sense of a religious awakening, but as a reflection of the deep humanity he now felt. This moment was not just a medical act, it was a moral one. The American soldiers and medics, who had seen their comrades fall in battle, still chose to offer compassion to their enemy. This was a stark contrast to the brutal treatment often given to captured Allied soldiers by the Japanese. The men now cared for were not just enemies, they were men in need, and that need transcended nationality or allegiance. The capture of skilled Japanese pilots was more than just a victory in the field. It was a strategic win. In the midst of the war, the Japanese Imperial Navy relied heavily on the expertise of its aviators. These men had been rigorously trained, often flying in high-stress, high-risk missions that tested their endurance and resolve. The value of capturing these pilots was immense, as they possessed invaluable intelligence about Japan's strategies, tactics, and military infrastructure. Prisoners of war, particularly those involved in aviation, could provide key insights into enemy tactics that could turn the tide in subsequent battles. From an American perspective, these captured pilots were also seen as potential sources of propaganda. The U.S. military could present these men to the public, emphasizing their capture as a victory not just over the enemy, but over the enemy's ideology. But even more than that, the intelligence gleaned from these prisoners could provide tactical advantages in future engagement. The recovery of their technical knowledge on aircraft performance, battle tactics, and the psychological makeup of the enemy's pilots could influence the U.S. military's own strategy, particularly in air combat. Yet, the value of a captured pilot was not just in the information he could provide. His very survival and rehabilitation played a role in shaping how the American forces viewed their enemy. The decision to treat these men with dignity, despite their role as enemies, presented a shift in the moral direction of the war, something that could not be quantified in intelligence reports or tactical assessments, but spoke volumes about the values that the United States hoped to preserve in the face of global conflict. The contrast in medical technology between the American and Japanese forces was stark, especially when it came to the care of prisoners of war. The United States, despite facing immense logistical challenges, had advanced medical techniques and facilities compared to Japan. By 1943, American field hospitals were equipped with modern surgical tools, antibiotics, and trained medical staff, allowing them to offer a level of care that was virtually unheard of in most parts of the world at the time. American doctors and medics were equipped to handle a wide range of injuries, from bullet wounds to burns and broken bone. They utilized cutting-edge methods to save lives, such as the use of sulfa drugs to prevent infection, a practice that had been developed in the late 1930s and was becoming more widely used by World War II. For the captured Japanese pilots, this was an entirely new experience. Many had never been treated for injuries beyond basic field first aid. The Japanese military, though capable, had limited resources when it came to medical technology. Their field hospitals often lacked the equipment necessary for advanced surgery, and their reliance on older methods of treating wounds was a testament to the lack of infrastructure in Japan during the war. The medical care these pilots received at American field hospitals was a revelation to them. Where Japanese soldiers were often treated with limited resources, their American captors offered them comfort, surgical expertise, and effective pain relief. The Americans used advanced techniques that not only saved lives, but also allowed the pilots to recover with minimal scarring or permanent damage. This technological gap would have been especially evident to the captured pilots, who, for the first time, found themselves experiencing an entirely different standard of care. The medical advancements in the American arsenal not only aided their own soldiers, but played a role in strengthening their moral and psychological position over their enemies. The message sent to the Japanese pilots was clear. The United States was not only winning in the air and on the sea, but it also held a humanitarian and technological superiority that further demoralized the enemy. The treatment of captured pilots also reflected the leadership styles of both the Japanese and American commanders. Japanese military leaders held strict expectations for their men. Honor, sacrifice, and loyalty were paramount. The concept of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, permeated their worldview. Japanese soldiers were expected to fight until death, and surrender was seen as an unforgivable act of dishonor. As a result, prisoners of war were often seen as a liability, and their treatment reflected the harsh reality of Japanese military doctrine. In contrast, the American military leadership, although still focused on achieving victory, had a more pragmatic approach to prisoners. The U.S. leadership followed the rules of the Geneva Conventions, which sought to protect prisoners of war, ensuring they received proper medical care, food, and shelter. While this was not always perfectly adhered to, especially in the most desperate situations, it was generally the policy of the United States to treat prisoners with dignity, particularly when they were airmen or soldiers who could provide valuable intelligence. The leadership decisions made by American commanders in the field, who ensured the captured Japanese pilots received the best possible care, were reflective of a broader strategy of maintaining the moral high ground. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about ensuring that the actions of the Allied forces remained consistent with the values they fought to protect. In contrast, the Japanese leadership, particularly in the early years of the war, had a much more rigid and uncompromising approach to military discipline and prisoner treatment. For the captured pilots, the American leadership's decision to offer medical care, even to the enemy, was a profound moment. It was a demonstration of moral authority and a reflection of the values that the U.S. sought to embody during the war. This contrast in leadership philosophies highlighted the divide not just in military tactics, but in ideologies that would shape the post-war world. For the Japanese Imperial Command, the capture of their pilots represented a significant blow to morale. These men were not just soldiers, they were symbols of Japan's aerial supremacy. Japan's Air Force, particularly its elite fighter pilots, had been an integral part of its early successes in the war. The loss of these pilots was more than just a tactical setback. It signified the erosion of a carefully constructed mythos that Japan was invincible in the skies. The psychological impact on the Japanese military leadership was profound. The realization that their highly trained aviators, the backbone of Japan's aerial strength, were being captured alive was a strategic blow. This went against the very ideals of the Japanese war machine, where surrender was seen as dishonorable and the loss of pilots in battle was expected. The Japanese military leadership was now faced with the unsettling reality that their pilots might not die on the battlefield, but might be taken alive, treated, and interrogated by the enemy. This undermined the ideological structure that had supported their war effort. In fact, the psychological warfare waged by the capture of these pilots was just as important as the intelligence they provided. The Japanese pilots who survived captivity would later report their experiences back to their superiors. The humiliation of receiving American medical care, especially when compared to the treatment they had inflicted on Allied prisoners, further eroded the resolve of the Japanese military. It was a reminder that their vision of total dominance was faltering, not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of their soldiers. The American forces, meanwhile, used the capture of these pilots as a tool to demoralize the enemy. They not only gained tactical intelligence, but also spread the word that their care of prisoners was a part of their moral high ground. The Japanese command, unable to reconcile the disparity between their own treatment of prisoners and that of the Americans, began to question the wisdom of their military strategies. This shift in perception, though subtle at first, would play a role in the larger psychological collapse that occurred in the later stages of the war. The treatment of prisoners during World War II often raised difficult moral questions. In the Pacific Theater, where the brutality of the conflict was unparalleled, these questions became even more pronounced. On the one hand, the American military's adherence to the Geneva Conventions and its effort to treat prisoners with dignity was a clear moral stand in the face of an enemy that did not always follow the same rule. On the other hand, the treatment of prisoners by the Japanese was often seen as a darker reflection of their wartime mentality. For the captured Japanese pilots, the care they received from American medics was a moral shock. Raised on a culture of total warfare, they had never experienced compassion from the enemy. Their encounter with American medical staff, who tended to their wounds and provided them with water and comfort, forced them to question their preconceived notions of enemy cruelty. For the pilots, these moments of care were deeply moving, but also unsettling. It disrupted everything they had been taught about warfare and the treatment of prisoners. The dissonance between the brutal image of the American enemy and the kindness they now experienced led them to wonder if they had been wrong in their assumptions. "Is this heaven?" one whispered, grappling with the idea that the enemy could show such humanity. On the other hand, the moral implications of this treatment were not lost on the American medics and soldiers. Despite the horrors they had witnessed and the pain of seeing their comrades fall in battle, they continued to adhere to their values. There was no joy in the victory of capturing an enemy pilot, but there was a sense of duty, a belief that regardless of the enemy's status, all men deserved to be treated with respect and care. This belief, deeply ingrained in the ethos of the American military, was a defining feature of their approach to warfare. It was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about maintaining one's own humanity in the process. This moral stance would be reflected in the post-war period, where the treatment of prisoners and the rules of engagement would be a key point of reflection for both sides. The Japanese, after the war, would come to realize the full extent of the moral divide between their treatment of prisoners and that of the Allies. For many, the war would not just be a conflict of territory and power, but also a moral reckoning. The turning point came quietly, but it would resonate deeply for the captured Japanese pilots. It was a moment of transition, from a battlefield of fire and destruction to the stark contrast of a hospital room. After days of uncertainty and fear, the moment they stepped into the American medical facility, still reeling from the effects of their crash and combat injuries, marked a profound shift. They had been conditioned to believe in the superiority of their military, their emperor, and their cause. Surrender was never part of the narrative they had been taught. As they lay on the operating tables, struggling with pain and confusion, the American medics began their work. Some of the pilots were still in shock, barely able to comprehend that they had been captured, and were now being treated by the very enemy they had been taught to hate. The American medics, with their steady hands and professional demeanor, moved quickly but carefully, administering life-saving treatment. It was not an act of revenge, but a simple, unwavering commitment to save lives, even those of their enemies. In this cold, clinical setting, where medical supplies were often scarce and time was always critical, something extraordinary happened. One of the pilots, a young man who had been gravely wounded in the aerial combat, looked up as an American medic leaned over him, gently stitching the wound on his side. The young pilot, still dazed and struggling to make sense of the situation, met the medic's eyes. There was no anger, no hatred, only a sense of bewilderment. He whispered softly, "Is this heaven?" The American medic paused, his hands steady, but his eyes softening as he heard the pilot's words. For a brief moment, the medic's face betrayed a flicker of empathy, an unspoken understanding that this was not just a war of weapons, but a war of ideals. To the medic, this was just another patient. But to the pilot, this was the first time he had ever felt anything remotely akin to compassion from an enemy. This small exchange symbolized a shift not just for the young pilot, but for the men who surrounded him. The hospital, a sterile and neutral space, had become a temporary sanctuary, a place where the lines of war blurred, even if only for a moment. For the American soldiers, this was not just a military victory, it was a moral victory. They had proven that the ideals they fought for, decency, compassion, and the respect for human life, still mattered. Even in the face of brutal conflict, the psychological and emotional impact on the Japanese pilots was immediate. The harsh dichotomy between their training and the reality of their capture had never been so glaring. They had been taught to fight until death. To surrender was a disgrace, but now they were receiving care from those they had once viewed as enemies. The Americans had shown them a kind of humanity that Japan's militaristic culture had rarely extended to prisoners. As the days passed, the Japanese pilots' initial shock began to give way to a profound internal conflict. They had been trained to die for the emperor, to embrace death as the ultimate form of honor. Yet, here they were, alive, wounded, and being treated by the very enemy they had once despised. The stark contrast between their treatment and the brutal ways Japanese soldiers treated captured Allied soldiers began to sink in. One pilot, after a few days of medical care, found the courage to speak to one of the American doctors who had been tending to him. Through broken English, he expressed the confusion that had taken root within him. "Why?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Why do you help me? You are the enemy. We are taught to hate you." The American doctor, who had seen countless casualties and had been hardened by the brutality of war, paused before answering. "We don't hate you," he said quietly. "We hate the war. We're here to help, no matter who you are." For the first time, the pilot heard the words that would challenge everything he had been taught. It was not just the medical care that had unsettled him, but this larger, unspoken truth. The Americans saw him not as a faceless enemy, but as a human being worthy of compassion, despite his role in the war. This exchange marked a critical turning point, not just for the pilot, but for the psychological and emotional dynamics between the captured men and their American captors. As the days wore on, the initial mistrust and fear faded into something more complex. A deep sense of gratitude mixed with confusion and guilt. The men began to question everything they had known about the enemy, about the war, and about themselves. For the Americans, this moment was just as transformative. The American soldiers had been trained to see the Japanese as the enemy, to view their actions as barbaric and ruthless. But here, in the sterile confines of the field hospital, they were forced to confront the humanity of their captives. The Japanese pilots, though enemies, were still men, frightened, injured, and vulnerable. The soldiers who treated them were reminded that war, for all its horrors, still left room for compassion. In the days that followed, as more Japanese pilots were brought in for treatment, the hospital became a microcosm of the war's moral and psychological complexities. It was a space where the brutal reality of conflict met the ideals of humanity. For those who experienced it, it became clear that war was not just a clash of armies, but of values. In that moment, the American medics and their Japanese captives were bound together by the simple, unspoken truth that no one, no matter their nationality or their role in the war, was beyond the need for care, respect, and dignity. The psychological shift was profound. The American forces now had a clear advantage, not just in military might, but in the moral high ground. The captured pilots would go on to provide valuable intelligence, but the true cost of their captivity was not measured in the information they gave, but in the emotional and psychological toll it took on them. Their experience would haunt them, reshaping their view of the war, of their captors, and of themselves. They had been given a second chance at life, and in the process, they had witnessed a kindness from the enemy that defied all they had been taught to believe. The aftermath of the captured Japanese pilots' experience went far beyond the immediate medical care they received. For the pilots themselves, it was a turning point in their understanding of the war. Once they were fit enough to speak, many of them were interrogated by American intelligence officers who sought information on Japan's aerial strategies and military capabilities. The pilots, though initially reluctant to divulge too much, could not deny the overwhelming evidence of their captivity. They had been cared for, not tortured. This simple truth began to weigh heavily on them as they recalled the horrific treatment they had witnessed or even inflicted on Allied POWs. In the weeks that followed, the American forces were able to extract valuable intelligence from their Japanese prisoners. They learned about Japan's aircraft, the tactics used in air combat, and even the psychological state of the Imperial Air Force pilots. The pilots' insights contributed to the development of new countermeasures against Japanese fighters, proving vital in future battle. But more than the technical intelligence, the psychological impact of the pilots' experience began to spread throughout the war effort. They began to understand that their own treatment, their survival, and the shift in their perceptions of their enemy played a significant role in the larger moral framework of the war. On the American side, the treatment of prisoners became a symbol of the values the Allies sought to protect. The decision to care for the Japanese pilots, despite the brutality of the conflict, was not just an isolated moment of compassion. It was part of a broader strategy to present the Allies as defenders of humanity, even in the face of unimaginable violence. This human element became a key aspect of American propaganda and public morale, showing that the Allies stood on a higher moral ground. For the pilots, the emotional scars left by their captivity were just as profound as the physical ones. Many of them struggled to reconcile the kindness they had received with the horrors they had once believed to be true about their captors. Some, upon returning to Japan, were seen as disgraced for having surrendered, even though they had been treated with dignity. The stigma of capture, combined with their internal conflict over how they had been treated, created a deep sense of psychological turmoil. In the long term, the experience of these captured pilots began to shift the internal dynamics of the Japanese military. There was a growing awareness that their brutal treatment of prisoners had not only alienated the Allies, but had also stripped away the humanity of their own soldiers. Many soldiers, particularly in the latter years of the war, would come to realize that the treatment they had given to their enemies had left them with fewer opportunities to extract useful information from captured soldiers, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield. The psychological effects were not limited to the pilots themselves. The American soldiers, too, were affected by their role as caretakers of the enemy. Many of the medics and officers who had interacted with the Japanese pilots reflected on the paradox of war, that they were forced to fight to preserve peace, yet had to extend compassion to those who represented the greatest threat to that peace. It was a constant, painful reminder of the moral complexities of wartime conduct. As the war continued, the American forces' treatment of Japanese prisoners became a key component of the psychological warfare that unfolded in the Pacific theater. The capture and subsequent care of Japanese pilots not only provided valuable intelligence, but also marked a subtle yet significant shift in how both sides viewed the conflict. For the Japanese, the loss of their skilled aviators was felt deeply. These pilots were seen as the elite of Japan's military, and their capture represented the crumbling of a myth that had long sustained the imperial military's morale. The image of their once proud warriors, now receiving care from the enemy they had fought with such fervor, was both humiliating and demoralizing for the Japanese command. The American forces, in contrast, saw the treatment of their captives as a reinforcement of their values. Despite the brutal nature of the war, where both sides had committed unspeakable acts, the Americans held fast to the belief that treating prisoners with dignity was essential to their cause. It was not merely about winning the war, it was about maintaining the moral high ground, showing the world that their victory would be rooted not just in military dominance, but in the preservation of human decency. As the war in the Pacific drew to a close, these moments of humanity, however small, became increasingly important. The capture of the pilots was one such moment, reminding both the Americans and the Japanese of the fragile line that separated them, even as they stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. For the pilots, those days in the American field hospitals were a strange, almost dreamlike interruption to the horrors of war. It was an experience that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. They would return home, not as victorious heroes, but as men who had survived the unimaginable, carrying with them the weight of what they had witnessed. For the Americans, the aftermath of this event was more than just the conclusion of a battle. It was a testament to the enduring belief in their ideals. The pilots who had been captured and cared for were treated with respect and compassion, qualities that would stand in stark contrast to the brutal treatment American soldiers received at the hands of the Japanese. The knowledge that they had fought, not only for victory, but for a sense of moral superiority, played a key role in the psychological resilience of the American forces as they faced the final push toward Japan. On a broader scale, the incident contributed to the post-war discourse on the treatment of prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, which were meant to ensure that prisoners were treated humanely, came under closer scrutiny in the years following the war. As more stories of the contrasting treatment of POWs came to light, both during and after the war, there was a renewed focus on the ethical responsibility of nations engaged in conflict. The American treatment of Japanese pilots, while not without flaws, served as an example of how the world could move forward in a more compassionate direction, even after such brutal and bloody battles. The treatment of captured Japanese pilots in 1943 serves as a powerful reminder of the complex moral terrain that wars often tread. At the heart of this moment lies a question that transcends the brutalities of war. What does it mean to remain human when faced with the most dehumanizing circumstances? In the Pacific, where the air was thick with hatred and destruction, this small but profound gesture, the care shown by American medics to their Japanese captives, revealed something deeper than the tactics of combat. It was a testament to the enduring power of compassion in even the darkest of times. The war was brutal, and the cost was immense. Lives were lost, entire cities were devastated, and ideologies clashed with unimaginable ferocity. Yet, amid the suffering, there were moments of humanity that offered hope, not just for those who survived the conflict, but for the future. These moments, while small in the grand scope of history, became the foundation for a more humane approach to warfare in the years that followed. The treatment of prisoners became a crucial component in the post-war era's discussions on human rights and international conduct. What had once seemed like an impossible ideal, that even in war there could be mercy and respect, became a guiding principle for a new world order. For the captured pilots, the experience would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had been taught that their duty was to die for their country, to fight without question, and to hold the enemy in contempt. Yet, they were shown a different side of warfare, one that they could never have imagined. They had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at a more complex understanding of their place in the world. The bitterness they had once felt toward their captors would never fully dissipate, but in time, They would come to realize the importance of the compassion they had received. For the American medics, this event, though far from the battlefield, was no less significant. It was a reminder that the war they fought was not just for victory, but for the ideals that defined their nation, ideals of liberty, justice, and humanity. It was a hard war, fought with bloodshed and loss, but it was also a war where, even in the darkest hours, a spark of light remained. And in that light, they found their true victory.